Today, what I'd like to talk about is to give a quick introduction to Colchester. I'm sure we're not the most famous fixed income manager in the world, so it might be worth giving a quick overview of who we are. We'll go on then, I suppose, to the meat of the presentation and talk about the positive impacts we believe you gain from integrating ESG into your process. So ESG, we prefer to look at it more as kind of governance, social, environment. Why is governance at the top? Well, I can't think of any country in the world that has good social standards or good environmental standards that doesn't have good governance at the top. So our belief is that if you have well-governed countries with a good social infrastructure who can develop their economy without completely depleting the environment, you're more likely to have a better economic outcome over time, which is good for a bondholder. We'll talk about how we think this works, and then we'll talk about how we actually incorporate that into portfolios. It's one thing having the idea, but how do you actually bring that into your portfolios? I'll talk about that. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about green bonds. So green bonds could be the answer. What is the question? Well, I suppose the question is that nowadays we're seeing quite a lot of demand from our clients who are saying they want to put ESG factors, green factors at the forefront of their investment strategy. And I think this fund that we're going to be launching soon in Australia could well fit the bill for those kind of clients, and then I'll do a quick wrap-up. So just quickly then onto who Colchester are. So we're an asset manager that's solely focused on sovereign bonds and currency markets. We believe in focus, so we don't have an equity team round the corner, so that if we have a bad year in bonds, we think, thank the Lord for those guys. Instead, it all comes down to us. We rise or fall as a business on what we do as a team in fixed income, nothing else. There's been no change in our investment philosophy or strategy over the years, so we stick to our knitting. We're doing the same thing across all of the portfolios that we run. Stable asset base, over 50 billion Australian dollars. What does that mean? Well, we're a stable company. We're going to be here for the long term. Experienced and stable investment team. I can guarantee nobody will get on this stage today and say, we've just hired some really good young grads and we're going to let them swing the bat. So what makes us stand out there? Well, in the 21 years that we've been running as a company, we've only ever had 2 people leave the investment team. So I think that genuinely is holding up quite well against most of our peers. Colchester in Australia, we've got over 6 billion in management. That's if you include your New Zealand cousins there. And it is possible that you've invested in Colchester funds before but not known it, because some of the big multi-managers, AMP, Mercer, Morningstar, all have our funds within their investment program. So even though you might not know us by name, it is possible that you've invested some money with us in the past. So let's go on to the meat of the presentation. As I said at the beginning, to us, governance is the most important thing out of ESG when you're looking at global bonds. Why is that? Because it's very hard to have anything else in your society, whether it be social structure, the kind of environmental standards, if you don't have good governance at the top. So how can we kind of prove that? Well, what we've done here, quite simply, and I've been told this pointer won't work, and I'm correct. Oh, no, it doesn't. So what we've done here is on the vertical axis, going up the side there, we have governance indicator scores. So these are like the IMF, the World Bank come out with these governance indicator scores. And then along the horizontal axis, the one at the bottom, you've simply got GDP per capita, how rich a country is. And you can see there's a very strong correlation between the better governance and the more wealthy a country is. And I think in some ways that's quite intuitive. You know, if you've got a good government for a long period of time, that means the economy is probably more likely to be doing better than if you've got a terrible government for a long period of time. So relatively intuitive. But I mean, how can we go a step further and kind of prove this? Well, that's quite difficult. I mean, what you'd have to do, essentially, I suppose, is take a country, split it in 2, check that it's a very homogeneous country, i.e. the population on both sides, it's the same kind of people. No big immigration inflows. As you know, in Australia, immigration can often help growth. So no big immigration inflows. And probably have the same starting point for your economic development, maybe after a large war that's destroyed everything. And the country that I think of, or the best example I could think of, was Korea. North and South Korea, obviously divided permanently after 1953 and the Korean War. So, you know, that's the best example I could think of, and it'd be really good if we could have a Korean specialist on stage today. But we do have this guy. So the picture on the right there, that is me, a 20-year-old me, and I was studying in South Korea at the time. You know, you're getting old when I showed this to my daughter, and she said, "Is that you, Daddy?" So there I am in South Korea. As I said, very homogeneous societies, not many immigrants. When I was in South Korea, I think this was 1992, there were only 50,000 foreigners in the country. 35,000 of them were US troops. So literally, when I went out to the countryside, like here, you know, these kids were saying that I was the first foreigner they'd ever seen in their lives, and that's why, very intelligently, they were getting my autograph before I became a superstar portfolio manager, you know. So it's probably worth a fortune now. On the left-hand side, there I am in North Korea. Looking a bit older, a few years later, I went on a trip to North Korea. I'd always kind of been interested in studying in the South. That's in Pyongyang, capital of North Korea. It's a pretty miserable place. I don't know if any of you have ever been to South Korea, but I mean, there's a real hustle and bustle about the country. North Korea, pretty average, to say the least. Now, this one here, I would have liked my pointer, but I'll try and explain it. I'll start on this side and go over there. What we have here, to give you an example of just how bad North Korea is Northeast Asia at night by a satellite photo. So on the right-hand side, the biggest, or the big kind of light area there, that's Tokyo. You go to the left, you've got Shanghai. Then you've got Seoul. Seoul is the big one there, kind of in the middle. And then there's a big black area above that, as I quickly walk across stage for kind of the money shot. That black area is North Korea. There's one light really that sticks out in North Korea. That's Pyongyang, the capital. If you live in the capital, you do a little bit better than everybody else in the country. But I mean, it's a very graphic kind of illustration of just how badly North Korea is run, that they can't even provide electricity for the country, especially when you compare it to South Korea just there. So it's not just the electricity they can't do. I mean, over time, like I say, don't forget, North Korea, South Korea, same people, same culture, same history, just divided, one with very poor government, one with, you know, better government. It doesn't mean they're the best in the world. What kind of outcomes do you get at the end of that? You can see here, North Korea, if you'd have a life expectancy of 72 years. South Korea, 83. So you're going to live 11 years longer if you have a reasonable government. GDP per head, $618 a year in the north, nearly 32,000 in the south. To give you an idea, Uganda has a higher GDP per head than North Korea. And don't forget, North Korea is in Northeast Asia, one of the most dynamic areas in the world economically. Exports, $308 million is all that North Korea exports. They do have sanctions on them, so that's obviously limiting their exports to some extent. And when I first showed this presentation to my compliance team, somebody nearly had a heart attack, said, "We can't do this." We do not invest in North Korea, just to make that sure. But 308 million, I mean, there's probably, you know, I would say a street in Sydney that's worth more than that. It's probably worth many times that, actually, the way property prices have been going here. So you compare that to the south, $555 billion worth of exports coming out of the south. The top three exports from the north. Number one, watch movements. Pretty convinced that's not Rolex getting their supplies there. Number two, fake hair. So the ladies there will cut their hair off and sell them as wigs abroad to make a bit of money. Ferroalloys, they've got a little bit of iron ore, but they're not going to be big competitors for you lads. What does South Korea export? Integrated circuits, semiconductors, cars, refined petroleum. There are no There's no petrol, no oil, no gas in South Korea, but they built a petrochemical industry from nothing, just importing the crude and manufacturing it there. So you can see the massive differences you get. I mean, it's not just governance, but by and large, the main difference here is governance. And when we're talking about governance, we're not talking about having Churchill in charge or something like that. You're not talking about a great leader. Rather, we're talking about institutions. You know, is your civil service corrupt? You know, is your central bank independent? You know, does the rule of law exist? Can you go to court and expect a fair outcome? It's things like that that really move a country forward. No country in the world is going to have one great leader after another after another. It's the institutions that really make the country. So let's move on to social. Hopefully I've shown that governance makes an impact. How does social make an impact? Well, we've got quite a similar chart here. Once again, along the bottom, you've got GDP per capita. So the further you are to the right, the richer your country is. But this time, on the vertical axis, we've got OECD PISA scores. So what are that? Well, the OECD, every 3 years, goes around the world, and they do standardized educational tests. This is for 15-year-olds. They do it in maths, they do it in science, and they do it in reading and writing in the language of whatever country that is. Now, you can see, once again, there's a pretty good correlation here between how wealthy you are and, say, how educated your children are. I suppose that makes sense. You know, you go on afterwards and they're going to workers, the better educated workers you have, the more productive you could be. Now, is this simply cause and effect? I'm not sure, if I'm being honest with you, because as you get richer, you can put more money in to education. So maybe it's not quite that simple. But since 1960, the World Bank have said that only 13 countries in the world have moved up from basically low income or middle income to high income countries. There's only 13. 9 of them are on this chart. It's probably worth pointing out before we get going on those 9, just on the top left there, you can see there's this massive outlier who appear to be the cleverest people in the world, but not actually that rich. That's China. Now, people have asked us for a long time when we give presentations and we talk about China, they're like, is this dodgy data, Martyn? You know, do you believe the GDP numbers? Do you believe the growth numbers? Do you believe the inflation numbers? And by and large, yes, we do for China. The data that they're producing has improved over the years. This is dodgy data, though. So China was asked to join, and they thought, we might not do that well. So what they said is we can do it in China, but you can only use Shanghai, Beijing, I think Shenzhen, and one other city. So basically, they cherry-picked the 4 richest countries in the city and said, you can do the survey there. And not surprisingly, they did quite well. It's kind of the equivalent of in Australia, of picking the 10 richest neighbourhoods in the whole of Australia and saying, we'll just test those kids. You probably do quite a bit better than where you are now, because unfortunately, one of the things that determines education tends to be the wealth of your parents. So that's an outlier, but for the others, you know, you can see all these red dots. You've got my mate, South Korea up there, Singapore, doing very well. My kids should probably be doing a bit better at school. You know, you can see that all of them have got good levels of education. So those that have succeeded have used education as a tool to do that. I always think when you're showing these kind of things, it's interesting to see where your own country is. So this is where Australia is on this chart. Now, another thing, obviously, you're doing this survey. It's global data, you know, testing kids in all these countries. They ask us, how accurate is this data? And it's a good question. You know, I mean, what I tend to do is a rule of thumb. Don't forget, the higher you are on this chart, the more educated you are. So I tend to look where Australia is. And I just checked that the UK is above you. And I think we'd all agree that's pretty robust data. Now, for some of the eagle-eyed, you might work out that Australia appears to be richer than the UK. And for all the statisticians in the room, that's what you call an anomaly, you know. So let's move on to the environment. So how does the environment make an impact, you know, as a bond manager? How would that make an impact? Well, let's have a look here. Similar chart again. This time, you know, same chart along the bottom, sorry. We've got GDP per capita, how rich your country is. This time, going up the side, we've got the Yale Environmental Performance Index. What's that? Well, Yale University have run this data for the last few years now, and every couple of years they update it. And it looks at a wide range of environmental factors, whether it's air quality, soil quality, rivers, wastewater, all these kind of different environmental indicators, and they've combined it into a score. Once again, you can see a very large correlation between how rich a country is and how well they're scoring environmentally. Now, for this one, I genuinely do not believe it is cause and effect. I suspect that it's more the point, as a country gets richer, you've got more money to spend on environmental issues. And as that country gets richer, people become more concerned about those environmental issues. If you went to a very poor country in the world and said, we're going to build a steel mill here and give you all jobs, I don't think there'd be many people thinking, what's the environmental impact of that? They'd be like, yeah, bring the jobs, we need the money. But as you get richer, these things start to matter more. So, probably one of the challenges for the world is if, you like things like biodiversity and, you're interested in climate change and stuff, how do you get some of those poorer countries to get wealthier without kind of destroying the environment like a lot of, frankly, developed countries did and then just retroactively fixed it up? That's probably going to be one of the challenges. Now, when I come to Australia, and I've been here for 2 years, but I do used to come here quite often, and after a hard day meeting our extremely happy clients, I used to go home and relax in the hotel by watching Sky News. And when I watch Sky News, and you don't have to watch it for long, you start to realise not everybody believes in climate change. And so I came up with something called the Schwarzenegger Doctrine, named after the famous Arnold Schwarzenegger himself. Because you've got to remember that Schwarzenegger wasn't just the Terminator, he was also the Governator. So he was the governor of California. And I saw an interview with him quite recently, actually, and I thought it was quite interesting. And he said, because Arnie, surprisingly, was actually an environmentalist. So we got into power, and these environmental consultants came in, or the pressure groups, and they said, right, Arnie, what you need to do is you need to get rid of cars, you need to stop people heating the home so much, or using aircon probably in California, and you need to stop them doing this and this. And he went, I can't sell this, in an Austrian accent, though. And, basically said, look, this isn't really going to work. The idea that I tell all these people, you can't do this, you can't do that. He said, I need, a better political message. And what he said he kind of came upon was pollution. So, that's what I'll try and do today, sticking to my Schwarzenegger doctrine. The World Health Authority, or the World Health Organization, sorry, they estimate that around 7 million people die every year from air pollution. And to put that into some kind of context, that's more people die from air pollution every year than have died from COVID so far. Now, the main killer is something called PM 2.5. What's that? It's particle matter. It's very tiny particle matters, like I think they're about a tenth the width of a human hair. And you breathe them in and they get into your lungs because they're so small, and then they can get into your bloodstream. Now, the main cause of PM 2.5 is car exhaust fumes and fossil fuel burning. So I then looked, what are the main causes of CO2 in Australia? Number one, fossil fuel burning to produce electricity. Number two is manufacturing, mining, commercial industry, that kind of thing. The third one, transport, i.e. cars. So it's the old one, you can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You're making your air cleaner and you're also reducing CO2 emissions. So even if you didn't believe in getting rid of CO2 emissions, as I can assure you, I've met quite a few Australians over the last 2 weeks who definitely think that, but you're making your air cleaner. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Now, Australia is quite lucky in that it doesn't have much in PM 2.5, but you might be thinking, well, 7 million people in the world, it's a big world. How dangerous is this stuff? And once again, that is incredibly difficult to prove. Because really what you'd have to do is some kind of controlled experiment where you'd either take, a town or a city or maybe even a region, split it in 2 and then pollute one part of the population and not pollute the other, right side by side. And you wouldn't have to do that for just a couple of days. You'd have to do that for years, maybe even decades, to really get any conclusive data of how bad this is for you compared to, the group that doesn't have the pollution. And obviously, there's no government in the world that would agree to that kind of experiment. Because, what are you doing? If your theory is correct, then half of the population in that experiment would have quite negative effects on them. Nobody is going to do that. Or would they? Now, this is a map of China. And I'd just like to say, if there are any Communist Party officials in the room, the Chinese government did not do this on purpose. This is what, I suppose, in the academic kind of jargon you call an accidental experiment. It's where scientists or social scientists look around and see if there's anything that could kind of replicate those conditions I've just been talking about. And this is the world-famous Kunming-Hua River winter heating policy. I thought you're all thinking, not another portfolio manager talking about this again. But now what is that dividing line, the black line there? Well, the Kunming Mountains are in the west of China, and the Hua River is in the east, roughly corresponding to where that line is there. And that's been the traditional dividing line between northern China and southern China. Now, when we think of China nowadays, you're thinking of this industrial juggernaut, getting richer by the day, very powerful. That wasn't always the case. In 1978, just before Deng Xiaoping began his economic reforms, China was one of the poorest countries in the world on a GDP per capita basis. So what the Chinese government did with this dividing line is they didn't have enough money to provide coal for everybody in the country for the winter heating. So they drew this, I wouldn't say it's completely arbitrary, but they drew this line, and in the north of that, you were allowed to have heating. And mainly that came from coal-fired heating, underfloor heating. In the south, the heating policy was a big woolly jumper. So there was no real coal-fired heating in the south. So over time, you got these massive differences in the pollution levels in northern China and southern China. So it kind of gave the conditions I was talking about for that experiment that you would need to see if it made any impact whatsoever. Now, the study that I read, they took 40,000 people who were based in urban areas. So it wasn't that, some guy was living in the countryside, so he got much cleaner air. And they were living within 5 degrees of that border, i.e. quite close to the dividing line between north and south. So some of them were getting polluted, some of them weren't. What is the difference? Well, in the northern part of the country, you were getting 3 years lower life expectancy. In other words, the pollution was kind of getting you a bit early, let's say. Now, the other thing about PM 2.5 is that high levels of it have been linked to reduced academic performance as well. And that was borne out in the experiment as well. So between 1975 and 1982, they looked at school children, once again in the same kind of area. And the northern children basically ended up doing 1 year less of schooling, i.e. they weren't doing very well at school, so they left early. It wasn't that the south was massively poorer, just a few miles away. That wasn't the case. It was the fact that, like I say, the northern children weren't doing as well. And then they went on to, as adults, they went and earned 13% less. If you're less educated, you tend to earn less money. I think, that's a pretty obvious link. So once again, as a bond manager, what do I want? Well, when I lend money, that's really what we're doing, to a country, I want their economy to grow, I want their children to do well at school, and I want them to earn a ton of money so they can pay us back quite easily. So even on the environmental side, we think there's real impacts that can come back towards managing bonds. So hopefully, I've convinced at least some of you that maybe looking at these ESG factors do make a difference in a bond portfolio. But it's easy to say that, so then how do we incorporate that? How do we incorporate the Kunming-Hua River divide? So what we've got here is At Colchester, we say we're a value manager, and the way that we value bonds basically is by prospective real yield. So what does that mean? We simply take the yield in today's market and we subtract where we think inflation is going to be in 2 years' time, which kind of makes sense as a bond manager. You want to get a valuation that's incorporating some kind of inflation number in there, because that's a big driver of bond prices. And we end up then something like a chart like this. Those on the left are the cheapest, the ones on the right are the most expensive. But we then adjust those numbers. And we adjust those numbers for something we call a financial stability score. What does that mean? Well, basically, what we're doing is we make an adjustment for how strong we think that country is, both on the balance sheet side. So if we're looking at government bonds, we'll be looking at things like how much money a government raises, how much money it spends, what the deficit is, how much debt you've got, those traditional kind of factors. But we're also putting in those ESG factors. How good is the governance in that country? What are the education? What is the social factors like? What is the environmental performance? Can they keep growing their economy if they just keep chopping down wood every year and sell wood abroad? Probably not. So we bring them both together into the financial stability score, and then we adjust our valuations for that financial stability score. So a country with a good financial stability score tends to normally have a good ESG score as well. We're moving up those valuations, so we'll basically put more money into those countries. Where it's got a poor financial stability score, we'll be reducing the amount of money that we would allocate. So systematically, through our process, those kind of ESG factors are counted in there into our valuations. So how do we go about this? Well, let's pick an example. Let's pick everybody's favourite country in this room, the United Kingdom. Now, it's funny, but when normally when we go and talk to people from any country, they always have a more negative view of their own country than maybe outsiders do. So when I saw this first chart on the left, this is CO2 emissions. 1990 was the base year, and who's cut the most. And bizarrely, I thought, the UK were almost like a world leader in this. Good for us, yeah. So you can see the other countries there. Germany not doing too bad. I can't quite read what that green line is at the top, but that doesn't matter. So how did the United Kingdom though go from reduce all its CO2 emissions? Well, on the chart on the right, there's a pretty good reason why. You can see back in 1990, over 60% of electricity in the UK was produced from coal. And the big thing that happened is we switched to natural gas. Now, I'll be honest with you, without going too much into economic history in the UK, that was a relatively easy transition for the UK. Why was that? Well, by 1990, most of the coal mines in the UK weren't particularly profitable. A lot of them had already been shut down. So politically, moving away from coal would be a lot easier than it would be in Australia, for example, where your coal mines are still very profitable. So, I'm not saying this stuff's easy, but that's what happened. And then we moved to natural gas, and that was pretty easy because we had North Sea oil and gas, so we could produce our own gas. And it'd be great if Australia had its own gas supply, wouldn't it? Hang on. So they moved to natural gas. Now, looking at this chart here, I don't want to say it was all super easy for the UK. I mean, in fairness, there have been moving up their renewable energy and also wind energy. So offshore wind, the UK is now one of the leaders in the offshore wind sector. So it hasn't all been easy, but as I say, a lot of it was that one-time shift away from coal. Another thing we look at then is, because once you start getting into the detail, especially in some of the environmental numbers, it's not always that simple. So all we have here is the blue bars are how much a country consumes in terms of CO2, CO2 per capita. And then the black bars are basically how much you're producing. So, basically how much your GDP kind of how much you're producing for unit of GDP. So what you tend to find in the richer countries, so you've got the United States there, Australia, obviously the UK towards the middle. The consumption is very high, but the actual, let's say, production is quite low. So why is that? Well, number one, you've probably moved a lot of this offshore over time, or you have probably genuinely become a bit better at doing it. But what you tend to find then in emerging markets is that they have much higher production, but much lower consumption. So you've got India on the far right of the chart. Their consumption levels are very low. Why is that? Well, when you go to India, you don't see a guy in a massive house banging out the aircon, with all the fancy mod cons in his house. They're a poor country, so the average person is going to actually consume very little CO2. So it's quite difficult to say that those countries on the left are doing a good job and the ones on the right aren't. You've got to kind of dig a bit deeper. So coming back to the UK then, what we have there is the electricity supply has been the biggest saver of CO2. Industry, we've kind of talked about. Some of that probably got offshored. Some of it will have been efficiency there and actually reducing CO2 emissions. So that then leaves transportation and residential dwellings. Transportation, if we're going to, in the UK now, they say they're going to go for net zero by 2050, and this is actually written into law. If they're going to get there, you're going to have to basically move everybody from a petrol car to an electric car. That is going to cost quite a lot of money because, getting rid of petrol stations, that probably doesn't cost that much, but you're going to have to put up charging posts almost everywhere. Every house is going to need them. You're going to have to retrofit all that infrastructure. That's going to cost a lot of money. An even bigger one is residential dwellings. I won't do a hands-up kind of survey, but, probably a lot of you have been to the UK at some point, and you walk around London and think, look at these lovely old buildings, aren't they great? They are nice to look at, but they're terrible to heat. Because when the Victorians and the Georgians were building these buildings, they weren't necessarily thinking of how best do I insulate this house. So retrofitting that is going to be difficult. I rent out my house in London that I used to live in and now in Singapore. And now you have to get an environmental certificate, I think it is, to rent it out. And it basically shows how efficient your house is. And mine's an old Victorian flat. And on that, it also gives you some ideas on how you can make it more efficient. So there was things like, putting like draft excluders on the doors or the windows or something, and that paid off in 3 years. I thought, yeah, I can do that. That seems a relatively good investment. Putting in wall insulation, because there's no cavity wall, the payback period was 140 years. Now, I'm a value investor. I'm thinking even my grandchildren might not benefit from that one, and they're not even born yet, So that is going to cost a lot of money, and most people will not kind of do that. It's quite a lot of money. I think it was about £14,000 it was going to cost, at 28,000 Aussie, roughly, give or take. A lot of people aren't going to do that unless the government helps them. So what we're trying to factor in when we look at the environment here and for the UK is all this money needs to be spent in the future if the government's going to do what it says, and we've got to consider that when we're thinking about their bonds, because we've lended them money and they're going to spend it in these areas, then how are they going to pay us back? We've got to think about those kind of factors as well. Just quickly onto this one. I think this, in some ways, this chart, what I'm trying to show is the complete lack of imagination of bond managers or government bond managers. The reason I say that is that when ESG came out, every bond manager in the world should have said, we're on top of that already. Every government bond manager should have said that. What is this? This is Australian government spending. It's in 2019, so before it was skewed a bit by COVID. And what do you, when you pay your taxes, what does it end up getting spent on? Social security and welfare is by far away the biggest. Helping your fellow Australians who are down on the luck, who wouldn't want to do that? Health. Who wouldn't want to help their fellow Australians when they're sick? Education probably needs to be a little bit bigger part of the pie if you're going to catch up us Brits. But, you're trying hard. So most of these are kind of things that ESG investing will go into anyway, and you're actually getting paid for doing this. So even if your bond manager does absolutely no ESG, this is probably quite a good thing to invest in if you're concerned about those kind of things. So green bonds could be the answer. What was the question, if you remember? Well, it's for people who want to put green bonds or green and ESG issues at the forefront of their investment strategy. So we've just looked at how Australia spends its money. This is my imaginary country here. So this government spends a third of its money on health. Yeah, everyone can kind of be happy with that. Spends a third on education. Might catch those UK guys. But then you've got a third of it on defence. You know, tanks sponsored by Colchester global investors. You know, it's that kind of thing. Not everybody would agree with that. Now, I used to be in the army, so I'm not too worried about it. But you can imagine that there are lots of different things in the government that maybe people wouldn't want to fund. So, you know, we went back to the Australian example. They put money into transportation. That could be extending the kind of metro lines in Sydney, so you get more cars off the road, and they say, well, that's something I agree with. It could be ploughing a motorway through a rainforest somewhere. I think, well, that's not what I want to do. So instead, you invest in green bonds. And what are green bonds? Well, they're just basically financing that goes towards projects that are helping climate and environmental issues. So on the left-hand side here, what we have is a geothermal power station in Indonesia. Now, we invest in the World Bank green bonds, and this is two of the projects that they've funded. So in Indonesia, 80% of their electricity is produced by fossil fuels, and the proportion of coal has been increasing. However, in Indonesia, if you've ever been there, you've probably been to Bali on holiday. In the middle of Bali is a big volcano. There's a string of volcanoes all the way up Indonesia. It's on the Ring of Fire. So it's one of the best places in the world for geothermal. However, if you build a coal-fired power station, your payback period tends to be quicker. And Indonesia isn't a particularly rich country, so it's really got to take those things into consideration. Now, the geothermal power station, it's not like my house with a 140-year payback, but it is a bit longer than a coal-fired power station. So the World Bank helped to build this. On the right, a bit easier, Lima, capital of Peru, they built a metro system, once again, trying to keep cars off the road. So when you're invested in green bonds, you know, you're kind of supporting investments to improve the planet. Similar defensive qualities to global bonds. Well, that's just our fund, not every fund, I'll be honest with you, and we'll come on to that in a second. You're getting an income that's similar to our global bond fund, a little bit lower. It's 2.1%. Now, I know that that's not mega money, but, you know, compared to, say, a bank rate in Australia, I'm taking a guess, it's not too bad. And also, we're seeing this as a growing area. There's more and more issuance, so over time, it should improve the kind of choices that we have. Quite simply here, we kind of have our opportunity group, our opportunity set of countries we'll invest in. Let's just say that this is the portfolio, and then how do we put this together? Well, what we do is we go out and we buy countries that we think are attractive, just like we would for our global bond fund, but where it is available, we'll buy a green bond. And to keep it simple for people like me, if it's a green bond, it's in green. So currently, that's about 89% of the portfolio. But there are some countries, say like Singapore, it doesn't have any green bonds. We like it, we'll go and buy it. So we're still looking for return. We're not just saying we'll buy a green bond no matter what, but we're trying to keep that proportion of green bonds high. The other thing, as I said at the beginning, we're a sovereign bond manager, so we don't put any credit in here. We're just buying governments and supranationals, things like the European Bank, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that's the World Bank that we were just talking about. We've even got some Queensland and New South Wales. So it's a very safe portfolio. 55% of it is in AAA rated assets. So, you know, in conclusion, because I've only got 50 seconds left according to this, you know, we genuinely believe that using ESG in your economic framework or your valuation framework genuinely leads to better financial outcomes over time. Well-governed countries with a good social infrastructure who can develop without completely depleting the environment are likely or likelier to have better economic outcomes over time. And Colchester systematically integrates that through our valuation process into portfolios. But for those investors who want to go that bit further, put green investing at, say, the forefront of their portfolio, the Green Bond Fund, which we should be launching in Q2 this year, I think is a real alternative for you.